from your parents that is still with you today? That's what I was afraid of. Is it going to be dead silent? No. What one thing did you learn from your parents that is still with you today? How to work. Okay. Always wear clean. Someone else.
Always to tell the truth.
Always to tell the truth. What else?
How to know if a shoe fits you.
I'm sorry?
How to know if a shoe fits you right. She always stuck her thumb at the toe. It had to be.
Okay. I'm with you, Obi-Wan Kenobi. How many of all the things that you learned from your parents are good things? And how many of the things you learned from your parents aren't so good?
I can't really think of anything that my parents taught me that weren't good.
Okay. So why do some people turn out bad? Their free choice. Where did they learn that? Yeah. Association with others in the world. Most teenagers will say something to this effect: I ain't going to be like my parents. And most 20-year-olds say, oh my goodness, I'm channeling my parents, or something to that effect. They sound very much like their parents. As our daughter put it one time, she stopped in the mid-sentence. She says, oh my goodness, I opened my mouth and my mother came out. You know, something along those lines. But which is more hereditary, good or bad? You think bad is more hereditary?
I think it's good.
You think it's good?
More good than there is bad.
Marvin?
I can't really say it's hereditary.
Okay.
It's more, it comes out in us easier than as we go through life than the good ones.
So when Jeroboam, son of Nebat, taught Israel how to worship other gods, where did he learn that?
All of his friends.
Did his dad do the same thing?
Not that we know of. Jeroboam was that person that was very instrumental in Solomon's kingdom, remember? And Solomon wanted him dead, and so Jeroboam fled to Egypt, and after Solomon died, the northern tribes brought him back. And he chose to put up those two calves, one at Bethel and one at Dan, in order to keep Israelites in the northern kingdom and not let them go to Jerusalem, not let them to worship. He taught them how to worship. And it seems as though time and time again, a bad king is followed by a bad king. Why is a good king not always followed by a good king? Maybe frightened of the people. Why else? But no. You have a good king. They're not worshiping idols. Why is his son not following his footsteps as a good king? Rebelling. But I thought we just said that most will learn good from their parents. But we rebel. Well, just kind of a brief synopsis. Failure of the North is what we're looking at. What all has happened in the book of Kings? We answered the question, who's going to succeed David as king? Adonijah thought it was going to be him, but it wound up being Solomon. And there's an interesting narrative in the book of Chronicles that does not appear in the book of Kings, that appears after Solomon was anointed as king and before David dies. And they actually anoint Solomon as king twice. And in between those two, David addresses the people of Israel. And he gives some very specific details to Solomon about building the temple. That's beside the point. We're not going to look at that tonight. Solomon, what was the main reason why the northern kingdom wanted to break away from a human perspective? Their main reason why they wanted to break away from Judah and the king. Tax relief. What was the real reason why? God decreed it because Solomon had worshipped so many idols. So once the kingdom is settled, we have two kingdoms. We have the northern kingdom of Israel. We have the southern kingdom of Judah. And we get the pattern of what's going on. And we have a king and how he succeeded the king before him and all that sort of stuff. Whether he is a good king or a bad king. The litmus test for whether he was good or bad in the northern kingdom was none other than Jeroboam, son of Nebat. And they all fell right in line with Jeroboam. And the litmus test in the southern kingdom was who? David. And if they were like David, they were a good king. And if they were not like David, then they were considered a bad king. And then we're introduced to the prophets. Why is it called the prophetic revolt? Why did I call it that? You're going to fail the test, folks. No. Well, there were false prophets and true prophets. But up until this time, the prophets had always supported the king. Up until this time, the prophets had always been advisors to the king. And starting with Elijah, and then Elisha, and then Micaiah, and Hosea, and Amos, and Isaiah, and Micah, they were all got in the king's face. And that's why I referred to that as the prophetic revolt. Well, once we finally get down all the way here to 2 Kings chapter 14, Elisha has died in chapter 13, and now the real focus is back on just the straightforward political military history with a minimal amount of prophetic intrusion in the book of Kings. Put it in context, where have we been? What all has transpired when we get here? Roughly 150 years has passed. Okay? The heels of Jeroboam's death, Ahijah predicted Israel would be destroyed because of idolatry way back in 1 Kings chapter 14 before we ever saw Elijah. And now in 2 Kings chapter 17 and following, we see that prophecy coming true. 150 years later, 8th century BC, it has been a struggle for both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom to survive. There has been a lot of outside interference that has been coming along. There's been a lot of tension between the two of them. It's hard to follow through everything without seeing some kind of military conflict of some kind. Elisha has been dead about 20 years, and the two kings are Jeroboam II. Boy, how would you like that for a namesake? Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, drove Israel to sin, taught them how to sin, put up those idols so that they would worship in Dan and Bethel. And somebody comes along and names their son Jeroboam. I mean, that'd be like somebody today naming their son Judas or naming their daughter Jezebel. He was king 786 to 746 BC, in roughly the same time frame. The king of Judah is a man either Uzziah or Azariah. He goes by both names. He is recorded by both names. You'll see Uzzah, and then you'll see Azariah, and then you'll see Uzzah again. It's talking about the same king. So the historical situation is we're probably about 770 or so BC. Elisha has been dead for about 20 years. The current world power wannabe is Syria. Now, remember, over here is Israel. You know, that over there is the Mediterranean. Here's the Fertile Crescent. Okay, over here is the Tigris and the Euphrates. It's where Mesopotamia is. It's where the Garden of Eden was. It's where Babylon will be. And if you're going up from Israel, you come up to Syria, also known as Aram in the Old Testament literature. The capital city is Damascus, and it's still hanging around today. It's still the capital city of Syria. You get a little higher, right up here to the very peak of the Fertile Crescent, and you have the nation Assyria. And what was the capital city of Assyria? Nineveh. And right at the moment, at this point in time, the world power wannabe is Syria, right here in Damascus. And they're trying to flex their muscles, but Elisha had already said Hazael's going to die, and Ben-Hadad becomes the next king, and he's starting to have trouble. He is down here messing around with Israel. And guess who's coming down, messing around on his northern border? Assyria. He's having trouble with Assyria. By all accounts, Assyria was a nasty piece of work. Cruel, brutal. They would go into a town, they'd kill everybody in the town, they'd chop off all of their heads, and then they'd build a little pyramid of heads on either side of the gate as people would come into town, just to let them know, you mess with us, this will happen to you. You're right. Except that, according to VeggieTales, they hit each other with fishes. But it's the same basic idea. I don't blame him one bit. I would not want to go. So, Israel and Judah, thanks to Assyria messing around with Syria, they are free from foreign trouble for about 30 years. For the first time since the Civil War, and they have split up into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. They are free from problems for about 30 years. And what happens when you're free from trouble? You have a little peace. You get stable. You get to grow. This is possibly the single greatest economic time in the two kingdoms' existence. The greatest single economic time was David and Solomon. That was the golden age of Israel. Trade developed for both nations. They were actually able to plant and harvest instead of having it all tore up by some invading army or some invading force. So they had agriculture that was going on. Economy became stable. More than likely, it took them 150 years, not because they couldn't make it happen, but because they had had so much outside trouble for so long. I don't know how many general elections I have voted in. I don't know how many midterms I have voted in. I don't know how many presidentials I have voted in. But you know, if one party gets going just a little bit nuts, they get replaced at the next election. Unless somebody just abuses their situation, it doesn't change a whole lot. And that's one of the beauties of our political system. Everybody gets up in arm in every election. I think, okay, it went the Democrats' way this time. Give it 4 years and it'll go the Republicans' way. You know? And I learned this a long time ago. My retirement plan really, really loves when one party's in the White House and the other party's in control of Congress. Because they're so busy fighting each other, the economy just runs with it. But what happens when that happens? When it gets stable? When the economy is good? When you have enough food to eat? When you're suddenly comfortable and you're suddenly relaxed? You let your guard down. With a good economy comes great materialism. You're no longer trying to meet needs. All of a sudden, you're dreaming about wants. With a good economy comes great materialism, and great materialism results in social injustice. How? I want this. I don't care what your needs are. Greed is rampant. Business practices immoral. Judges bribed. Israelites take advantage of Israelites. More free time, more money, more alcohol, more sex. It all just explodes. This is what Amos prophesied against. This setting, this situation. He went so far as to refer to most of those fat and happy women in the northern kingdom as the fat cows of Bashan. And not far behind comes Baal worship. Jehu all but eradicated it after he got rid of the Amorite dynasty, after he killed off Jezebel. He all but eradicated it. It is coming back. And good old Judaism, down in Judah, legalistic, without a real relationship to Yahweh. With a good, didn't I just read this? Did we? Citizens taking advantage of citizens, legalistic Christianity without a relationship with Jesus Christ appearing in the Bible Belt. I'm not so sure we're so far removed from Israel back in that time, the way the culture ran. I'm sorry, Peggy? It really does. Morally, not so good. Well, Syria's trouble with Assyria grows worse and worse and worse. And Jeroboam II dies. Israel had 5 kings in 14 years. What does that do to a kingdom? And they kept changing kings hand over fist. I won't kill you, and then you kill me, and then somebody else will kill you. And it was all over the place. 745 BC, a man by the name of Tiglath-Pileser III became the king in Assyria. He's also sometimes referred to in the biblical literature as Pul, P-U-L. He sets his sights on what every world ruler wannabe sets his sights on. I'm going to take over the world. My little piece is not enough for me. And so he sets his sights on Israel. He's already taken Damascus, Syria, Aram. He sets his sights on Israel. Israel allies herself with Syria up here, which is not much use because they're a vassal to Assyria, with Edom down here, and with Egypt way down over here, and Moab. But they never went to Judah. They went to everybody all around Judah, but never went to Judah. And when Assyria finally gets rid of Syria once and for all, there's no buffer zone between them coming down and hitting the top of Israel. The buffer zone that was there was Syria, and it is completely gone. All Israel can do is just wait because Assyria is coming. And what we have here, up here is Damascus. This area is known as Syria, also known as Aram in the biblical literature. Assyria is up here somewhere in the ceiling. Okay? He comes down here, then he comes down here, and he goes through all of this, and he's taking this territory right here. All of Galilee, all of the Decapolis, a lot of the Samaritan, the central hill country, that is all falling to Tiglath-Pileser III. He dies, and his successor, Shalmaneser V, decides that Tiglath-Pileser was just kind of dancing around and not really taking advantage of his situation. So he directs all of his energy in an all-out attack against Israel. He comes to the northern kingdom's capital city of Samaria, besieges it for 3 years, and the capital city falls in 722 BC, and the northern kingdom is done. They're gone. Like that. They had only had 30 years of prosperity. They were gone. He's ignoring Judah for now. Israel is dead meat. Interesting. What do you do whenever you want to be a world ruler and you come in and you take over another land? You have to figure out what you're going to do with the conquered people group. If you leave everything intact, then it makes sense that they're going to get their feathers ruffled having been conquered, and so they're going to try to assert themselves and try to retaliate and try to have some kind of coup or revolt or something along those lines. rulers knew this. And so Shalmaneser had a very interesting policy. When he came in and he conquered another country, this is what he did. He said, okay, all of you line up. I'll take 3/4 of you and I'm going to scatter you to the 4 corners of my empire. I'll leave just 1/4 of you here. But in the process of doing all that, I've got all these other conquered people groups over here, and I'm going to bring some of them into your country, and I'm going to bring some from there into your country, and some from there, and some from there. And what's left? You don't know the person who lives across the street from you, so you go over to introduce yourself, and you don't even speak the same language. You don't eat the same foods. You don't dress the same. You don't look the same. In 2 Kings chapter 17, it says, the king of Assyria brought people into Israel. 17 verse 24. He brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the people of Israel. They took possession of Samaria. They lived in its cities. And at the beginning of their dwelling there, they did not fear the Lord. If you go over to verse 29, every nation that was there were still some Israelites there, but these were the nations that Shalmaneser brought in. Every nation made gods of its own and put them in the shrines of the high places that those of Samaria had made. Every nation. The men of Babylon made Succoth-Benoth. The men of Cuth made Nergal. The men of Hamath made Ashma. The Avites made Nabaz and Tartak. The Sepharvites burned their children in the fire to Adramelech and Anamelech, the gods of Sepharvaim. They also feared the Lord and appointed from among themselves all sorts of people as priests of the high places who sacrificed for them in the shrines of the high places. They feared the Lord, but they served their own gods. What do you have? How long does it take for you to be able to communicate to that person across the street who does not speak the same language you do?
It takes a long time. I moved across the street from a guy from Van Horn, and I didn't know he was over there until a year after they moved in.
And if they speak one language, and they speak one language, and they speak one language, and they speak another, where do you find somebody you can talk to? Down the street and across? Maybe. What have you done? There will be no revolt because you're not even sure if you trust the person because you can't talk to them. That was Shalmaneser's plan. But over time, you begin to understand. Over time, you begin to talk. Over time, cultures begin to blend together. You know, I don't really know what that is that you fixed, but it's pretty good. And you see, what did it say? It said they worshiped their own gods and they feared the Lord. Who does this turn into? The result of all of this appears in the pages of the New Testament. They possessed Samaria. They lived in its cities. Eventually, they intermarried with the few Israelites that were left. Tended to probably be the more poor ones that were left. And it was the city of Samaria. They were called Samaritans, and they're still called Samaritans in the New Testament. Good Jews going from Judea to Galilee in the New Testament, did they go through Samaria? Why did they avoid it? They were half-breeds. They had intermarried with other people. Who did they intermarry with? Babylon, Cuth, Hamath, Avites, Sepharvites. The fascinating thing is, by the time we get to the pages of the New Testament, that intermarried group, those half-breeds, the few Israelites that had been left that had intermarried with all these other people groups that Shalmaneser had brought in, One was a woman at the well. And she could talk about the Jewish religion with Jesus. Where's the right place that we should worship? You say we should worship in Jerusalem. We say we should worship at this mountain. Somehow or another, that was still a present part of their existence, their life in the first century world, in the pages of the New Testament. But this is where it all got it started. New culture has been developed. Well, chapter 17 tells us why the northern kingdom of Israel fell. In short order, simply put, they rejected Yahweh and His covenant and they practiced idolatry. They began by tolerating other gods. And once they tolerate them, they say, well, it's not a big deal. Sure, live and let live. Coexist. And after they coexisted for a while, they actually followed the other gods and they forgot Yahweh. Ultimately, they worshiped Baal. There were multiple Baals. It seemed like every country had a Baal. It was the Baal of this city and the Baal of that city and everything else, but it was still the same basic idea. Where do we see from all of this? Well, we see where the Samaritans in the New Testament came from. What else can we learn from the northern kingdom of Israel? Well, no people group can last for very long if they mistreat each other. It only took them 30 years of prosperity and social injustice before they fell. A mark of rebellion is a refusal to learn. Subsequent generations could have learned. That didn't work out real good for my granddaddy. I think I'll do it different. They just kept right on going. Oh, what is that? A sign of craziness is doing the same thing the same way and expecting different results. They did the same thing the same way. They expected better results. That's crazy. Even tacit acceptance of religious pluralism results in disaster. Let me tell you what religious pluralism is. It's when you worship more than one God. Even if it's only two gods, there's still more than one God. So you're worshiping two gods. It's still religious pluralism. If you just accept it, if you just allow it, if it's just hanging out over there, it will come back to get you. Ahab at least gave lip service to Yahweh until he married Jezebel, right? He kept talking about your God. He kept saying, call upon Yahweh for me, Elijah. All the time he's worshiping Baal. The only key to real success, faithfulness to God. Faithfulness to that covenant relationship they have with Him. What else can we learn from the fall of the northern kingdom? Yeah, they sure didn't, did they? It just, golly. They didn't pay a whole lot of attention. When they returned after Nebuchadnezzar, it was Judah that returned. Israel, the northern kingdom, never returned. Now today, Israel has most of its prior territory back. But in the biblical narrative, the northern kingdom never returns. It doesn't mean that the 10 tribes are gone, because they're not. They never came back. Well, the south was a little bit different. From the very beginning, the north was in trouble because of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. The south had more of a roller coaster ride. And it's the rest of 2 Kings. We're not going to look at all of this tonight. In fact, we'll only look at a little bit of it. But it did last for another 150 years. It lasted almost as long after Israel was gone as it lasted before Israel was gone. Not quite, but almost 140, 150 years. Of course, the first 200 years, it's all about how faithful they were to God, how faithful they were to Yahweh. Did they measure up to David's footsteps? So at this point in the narrative, About the time Israel's destroyed in 722 BC, there's a sequence of 3 rather extreme kings in Israel. The first one was extremely evil. The second one was extremely good. And the third one gave a whole brand new definition to evil. If you look him up and you look up evil in the dictionary, you have a picture of him next to the word. That's how bad he was. The first one was a king by the name of Ahaz. And about the time that Assyria is finishing up with Israel and mopping up what's left, Ahaz, the king, tries to make nice with Assyria so that they'll leave him alone. He actually goes as far as the capital city, and he meets there. He goes to Damascus, and he meets with people in Damascus, and he goes on up into Nineveh, and he's meeting with people there, and he sees something that he thought it was just so neat, so attractive. It was an altar that they used to worship whatever god they worshiped. And he said, anybody got a quill and a piece of papyrus? I want to draw this. And so he sketched it out. And when he got home, he handed it over to a general contractor. He says, I want you to build an altar that looks just like that. He said, okay. And he built an altar that looked just like that. And he took out the altar of burnt offering in the temple, and he replaced it with that altar to that god, and he shut the temple doors. He was followed by Hezekiah. He didn't last 7 years. Ahaz didn't last 7 years after he did all of this, and he was gone. He is followed by Hezekiah. And one writer put it this way, Hezekiah was as good as David, if not better. I'm not so sure about that, but it's possible. That's how good Hezekiah was. Hezekiah invited the remnant of the northern kingdom, those poor people who had been left there by Shalmaneser. He invited them to Jerusalem, and they reinstituted the Passover, and they had this incredible Passover celebration in Jerusalem with all the people that were living in Judea and people who had come from what was left of the northern kingdom. He actually listened to prophetic advice. Whenever he was getting ready to continue that alliance with Assyria, Isaiah came up to him and said, nah, it's not a good idea. Don't do that. And he listened to what Isaiah had to say. In the process, though, he made overtures to Babylon. Mistake. Envoys from Babylon come in, and he says, well, here, let me show you everything in my throne room. Now let me show you everything in my palace. Now come here, look at the temple. Oh, wait a minute, I haven't shown you the treasuries yet. Look at all this gold and all this silver and all these precious gems. And the envoys from Babylon going, very interesting. Sennacherib heard. Israel, Judah is here. They are almost a vassal state, but they have had an alliance. Not truly vassal, but alliance. Almost vassal with Assyria up here. Here's Babylon. Babylon's come all the way over and all the way down, and Hezekiah has shown them everything, and they are on their way back after seeing everything. And Sennacherib hears about this, and he says, you know, that's treason. Because who is Assyria doing battle with on their southern borders? Babylon. So he decides that the best thing in the world would make Judah an occupied country. Later in Hezekiah's life, we start to see some questionable decisions, not necessarily beyond messing up with the envoys from Babylon, but because of the results of his health and everything else that he did. We don't see it directly, but Hezekiah became ill. And Isaiah came to him and said, thus saith the Lord, you're about to die. Put your house in order. And it says that Hezekiah rolled over and prayed, and then God heard his prayer. And what did he tell Isaiah? Because Hezekiah has repented. Go back and tell him I've heard. He's got 15 more years. And he was given 15 more years. He was one of the absolute best kings, almost as good as David, if not better than David. And he had a dirty, rotten scoundrel for a dad. And the sad thing is, he had a dirty, rotten scoundrel for a son. Ahaz was extreme evil. Hezekiah was extreme good. And Hezekiah's son was extreme evil. Just prior to Hezekiah's death, Isaiah passes from the scene. Micah passes from the scene. Around 700 BC, something like that. 30 years earlier, Amos predicted there would be a famine of hearing God's word. It came to pass. There were no prophets. Hezekiah didn't have anybody else really to listen to once Isaiah kind of passes from the scene. And then the worst king in either Israel or Judah appears. What was his name? Manasseh. How long did Manasseh reign?
52 years.
Over 50 years. That's a lot of evil.
He was 12 when he started.
He got started early. How was he extreme? He made his granddaddy look like a good guy. And so, with Manasseh coming to the throne, Judah is an occupied territory. Assyria still has their say over what's going on. Idolatry is now rampant. Thank you very much, Manasseh. There are no prophets, no word from God in the land. What is this setting up? What is this setting Judah up for? Disaster. 625 BC, Assyria down here occupying Judah when they're normally up here. Babylon rebels. Judah is suddenly free to do pretty much what they want to do because all of Assyria's forces are being drawn back up here and coming down to deal with the encroaching Babylonian force. And enter Josiah. Manasseh dies and Josiah enters. He is one of two known as the boy king. The last good king of Israel. During his reign, roughly 640 to 609, Judah's got a chance. Amos predicted a paucity of prophetic word. Now, look at all the prophets. Nahum, Jeremiah, Zephaniah, Habakkuk. And they found something as they're cleaning up the temple down in the basement. What did they find? Book of the law. And they read it to Josiah, and Josiah rips his clothes and says, "We have been disobeying God." He has it read to the entire nation, well, everybody who comes into Jerusalem. And they start making all these changes to get back in line with what God's expecting. They actually reinstitute the Passover for the first time since Hezekiah, his granddaddy. Too little, too late. It just simply wasn't enough. 609 BC, Assyria is about done. They're fighting with Babylon. Everything is going bad up here. And they send word all the way down to Egypt to Pharaoh Necho. Help! And so here comes Pharaoh Necho marching to Assyria's aid. And they're coming right up through Israel. And Josiah gets it in his head that he's not going to let them go by. Pharaoh Necho says, "Go home, little boy." He's not a little boy by this time, he's probably in his mid to late 30s. But he says, "Go home." But Josiah presses the issue. He faces him in battle, and he's killed. And control kind of falls to Egypt for about 4 years. Egypt keeps right on marching. They're coming all the way up. They're going to help Assyria. By the time they get up here to help Assyria, Assyria is basically done for. They have to face Babylon. The battle of Gilgamesh? Carchemish. 605 BC, Babylon has already defeated Assyria. They defeat the Egyptian forces. And as Egypt is running all the way back, here comes Babylon. And who's in their way? Israel. Judah. And now Judah kind of falls into Babylon's hands. And the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, They kind of tried to deal with Nebuchadnezzar for about 20 years, but it didn't work. Not real well. Nebuchadnezzar made 3 trips to Jerusalem. The first trip was around 605 BC, whenever he's chasing Egypt back home, and he stops off in Jerusalem. Oh, look at what I just conquered. Probably when he took Daniel captive. They rebel some 7-8 years later, 598, 597 BC. He returns, and that's when Ezekiel was taken. They get real stubborn. They refuse to do anything at all. And Nebuchadnezzar says, I'm going to have to teach them a lesson. So he returns in 587. He destroys the temple. He pulls down the walls of Jerusalem. Jeremiah, while Judah is rebelling, calls for peace. It will go good for you. Give in. Let Nebuchadnezzar have his way. It'll be okay. They wouldn't listen. Remember Shalmaneser's conquered people group policy? I'm going to take 80% of you and scatter you to the 4 winds. I'm going to let 28% of you stay. Well, Nebuchadnezzar had a different policy. He thought, this is what will really, really work. I'll take all their leaders and just leave everybody else there. Because if they have their leaders and I don't have their leaders, who's going to lead them? He took all the leaders and he put them in concentration camps right there near Babylon where he could keep an eye on them. So Judah did not lose as high a percentage of the population as Israel did. They were able to maintain some of their cultural identity. They were able to stay where they were. They just didn't have any walls around Jerusalem. They didn't have a temple. So now, after I've drawn here and here, I'm just amazed I can put my hand in. Okay, here we go. This is Babylon. This is Assyria. This is Syria. And so it starts with Syria and the northern kingdom. Syria falls to Assyria. Assyria takes the northern kingdom. Assyria then falls to Babylon. Babylon marches all the way up here, coming down chasing Egypt. And they're right there, and they're in Jerusalem. He comes from here not once, not twice, but 3 times because of the trouble that Jerusalem gave him. There was a remnant primarily poor, but there was enough there that they could maintain a little bit of cultural identity. And some of them said, we're not going to stick around and let Babylon do this anymore. And so a group fled to Egypt. They actually kidnapped Jeremiah and took Jeremiah with them. This is a defining moment in the history of the Jewish people. It is the most devastating punishment that they could experience because the land was theirs, and now they've lost it. God had said, it is yours as long as you worship me. They quit worshiping him. They lost the land. Yeah, for 70 years. Not permanently, but they lost the land. That just woke them up. What have we been doing all this time? All of this, we see this in so many other places of all of Scripture, the fall and the exile and everything else. Psalms 107 to 150 rejoice over the return from exile. Lamentation mourns the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. Daniel and Esther live in exile. Ezra and Nehemiah are returned from exile. So much of this is still built around this particular event. The fall and the lessons learned did this. The primary, number one, single greatest problem Israel had faced up until this point, repeatedly, again and again and again, was idolatry. Every time you turned around, it was idolatry. Nothing else came even close to idolatry in Israel's life until after this. After the exile, they have been rigidly monotheistic. It has been God and God alone, Yahweh and Yahweh alone. We will never, under any circumstances, worship any other God than Yahweh. It got through to them that they had been playing a little loose with God's expectations as spelled out in Exodus and Leviticus. Josiah had incredible reforms once he found the Word of God. And he decided to be obedient to it. Questions, comments? I took you along a longer road than I intended to take you along tonight. I didn't think we would get this far. Ahaz, evil. Hezekiah, good. Why did Hezekiah not follow in his father's footsteps? Ahaz.